particular section, flowers section as it's called within the Dhammapada, comprises of 16 verses, 16 beautiful, eloquent, challenging verses of deep and profound teaching and observation. I'm not going to read it all. I will encourage you to do that yourselves. I'm just going to read not even really half of the verses, but then try and draw out from those verses some of the kind of key themes and the key teachings from them. So first of all, it's kind of interesting to consider that in this section, the Buddha used the analogy of flowers and scent or perfume throughout this section as an analogy for the spiritual life, for the life following Dharma teachings. And that sort of highlights that following a Buddhist life, following a spiritual life, is a beautiful life. It is not a life which is sour, a life which is austere, a life which is miserable, like some black-cloaked, pious character out of a Dickens novel or anything like that. It's a life that is liberating, it's a life that's full, and it's a life that is thoroughly enjoyable. Flowers are also, they're very, very rich symbolically for Buddhists because there are classical representations of impermanence. So they're often found on shrines. They're offered to shrines. When we're having our mitra ceremonies, for example, as part of the ceremony, mitras are invited to offer a flower to the shrine as a symbol of impermanence. So it's both a very kind of easy to grasp symbol of Buddhist teaching, but also a symbol of the beauty and of the liberation of a Buddhist life. So I should start by reading the first two verses and then try and unpack them a little bit. So the first two verses are as follows. Who shall conquer the earth and the realm of death with its deities? Who shall make out the well-taught verses of truth as an expert picks flowers? The learner of the transcendental path shall conquer the realm of death with its deities. The learner shall make out the well-taught verses of truth as an expert picks flowers. Now in these two passages we have a sense of, well, we have the use of the word conquer. The word conquer used here is not as it is in a sort of vanquish or kind of almost a violent conquering. It's more like a mastering or a full understanding. And the analogy is that the expert picks flowers. So you can imagine in the Buddha's time and even today, people will pick flowers for a certain purpose. So people making a garland for a wedding, people making a bouquet of flowers to offer to somebody, will pick like an expert. They will pick flowers that are appropriate for the purpose, the flowers that are fit for purpose. And so the learner the learner on the path, which we all are until such times as enlightenment is reached, are being invited to pick truth with the same way, to pick our verses of truth with the same degree of expertness or fit for purposeness that an expert flower picker picks flowers. So to me that implies and highlights that it's not necessary to know everything about the Dharma. We're blessed with having vast libraries of Dharma works and Dharma teachings. We're not invited or we're not under any pressure to have to know all of those teachings. what we're invited to do is to pick like an expert. So to go much deeper with any of the teachings that we have. So the invitation here is like an expert learner, is to have an awareness of where we are and what we need, and to go deeper with teachings that we know that we need or we feel that are particularly helpful. Rather than trying to learn everything and ending up being masters, as it were, of none. Now, I know for myself personally, very early on, I was very struck by the teachings of Dhammapada, the teaching of conditionality, the teaching that all things arise independent upon conditions. That teaching struck me very deeply and still does. I still reflect on that teaching a lot to this day. Around the same time, however, I did hear about the teaching of the Lakshanas, which we had very, very expertly elucidated by Sadharaja 2 weeks ago. Now, I must confess, when I first heard the teaching of the Lakshanas, it didn't strike me to the same degree that the teaching on conditionality did. At the time, I found something slightly obvious and potentially slightly depressing about the teaching of the Lakshanas. So I kind of left it. I was quite happy carrying on and reflecting on conditionality. But as time's gone on, I've grown more and more drawn to the teaching of the Lakshanas, the three marks of conditioned existence. And as time's gone on, I've noticed more and more the truth of those teaching in our experience. So the invitation here so eloquently and beautifully presented by the Buddha of the expert flower picker picking flowers for the particular purpose is to pick the truth of teachings within an awareness of where we're at and what teachings we need, and to go deeper with them rather than to have a broad breadth of knowledge like sound bites of Dharma, but little in the way of depth. So the key being an expert. So moving on from those sections, we have another section which really kind of takes us to the heart of Buddhist teaching. In section 3, which I shall read, seeing the body as froth and thoroughly comprehending its mirage nature, let one proceed unseen by the King of Death, having broken the flower-tipped arrows of Mara. So this is a very challenging section. So in this one, we're invited to see the body as froth and to see its mirage-like nature. So we all know that a mirage is in an imaginary sanctuary. Classically, the mirage of an oasis in the desert, and a thirsty traveller who sees a mirage believes in its salvation, but is only dashed to find that it doesn't exist. So here the Buddha is drawing that analogy in the way that we tend to interact, or that we tend to see reality. We tend to grasp onto the permanence or the salvations of things that are incapable of providing that. There's also the rather lovely term of the flower-tipped arrows of Mara. So in Buddhist literature, Mara is always the baddie. The Buddha being the goodie, Mara is always the baddie. Somewhat analogous in Christian literature to the devil. And the flower-tipped arrows of Mara are in a way how we get snared into things that we think are good, but in fact cannot give us salvation. So traditionally, the flower-tipped arrows of Mara would refer to love or to sexual infatuation. But they could easily refer to any form of infatuation. It could be romantic love, it could be sexual infatuation, it could be infatuation with status, it could be infatuation with wealth, it could be infatuation with any number of things that we invest in. We invest a lot of our time and energy and beliefs in as something safe and something that would save us and something that will bring us lasting satisfaction. But in fact, they won't. None of these things will. And that's how we're invited to break these flower-tipped arrows of Mara, to see through the shallowness of the infatuations that can grab us and can divert us from the path towards, as it were, true salvation, which ultimately would be enlightenment itself. So moving on to verses 6 and 7, which are two very lovely verses, we have, "Let the silent sage move about in the village as the bee goes taking honey from the flower without harming colour or fragrance. One should pay no heed to the faults of others, what they have done and not done. Rather, one should consider the things that one has one's self done and not done." So there's quite a lot in these two rather simple verses. So in a way, it could be summarised as kind of mind your own business, but not in a kind of admonishing way. We could also think about it in terms of making sure that our own house is in order. Or indeed, we could borrow the more modern phraseology of people in glass houses and realise that to some extent we're all living in a glass house. So we have here the example in the image in the first verse of the silent sage. Now, silence is very important. Silence, the sage is not preaching, the sage is not, as it were, making anything about himself known. As a sage, he's very wise, it's why he's known as the sage, but the sage is silent. And here we're really being pointed towards the importance of silence in the spiritual life. On our retreats, they are very often held with large periods of silence. We were invited to have our tea break just a few moments ago in silence. Silence is important because it's during silence that we can have, as it were, deeper communication with ourselves. And indeed, during extended periods of silence, there can be quite extensive and deep communication between individuals, but just not using words. There are other ways of communicating, and we can be more in touch with them. Silence can be very liberating. It can be very liberating to just realise that you don't have to think of anything to say. You don't have to worry about not having the answer to a question somebody might ask you. None of these things are important during periods of silence and can be very, very liberating. So the other image in this passage is to move about the village as the bee goes taking honey from the flower without harming colour or fragrance. So here we have the image of a bee going from flower to flower and not harming either the flower or its fragrance. So I find this an incredibly powerful image and of how we should be interacting with each other, particularly in the realm of speech. We should be interacting with each other in a way where nobody is left harmed. So it's very kind of salient to think about the number of interactions we have where we're talking to people and we may have said something wrong and got a sense that we were misheard or that we'd misread a situation and that we'd upset somebody. I know that that's happened to me many times. I know it happens to many people. What we're being invited to here is to become like a sage who's like a bee, whose every interaction with a flower leaves that flower unharmed and in fact even enhanced. So bees pollinate flowers. They're very good for flowers. They're very good for plants. They're very good for propagation. So I think it's an amazingly beautiful kind of invitation to be in the world in a way and in interaction with everybody else in the world in a way that leaves everybody else enhanced after we have had an interaction with them. They've not been harmed, they've not been put down, they've not been let down, they've not been insulted, they've not been told anything they didn't particularly want to hear. They've been enhanced by an interaction with us. An incredibly beautiful image for how to be in this world and how to interact with other people that we share it with. So the fact that this is so important in the realm of speech, we carry on with in the next two verses, where it says, like a beautiful flower, brightly coloured, but without scent, even so useless is the well-uttered speech of one who does not act accordingly. Like a beautiful flower, brightly coloured and scented, even so useful is the well-uttered speech of one who acts accordingly. So here the analogies introduced in the previous two verses are really brought home in a sense that we really have to kind of, as we could say, walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So if we want to follow a spiritual life and if we want to lead people into a spiritual life, we have to have a degree of authenticity. We have to have a degree of integration. We have to be wholeheartedly expressing our aims and our aspirations to make spiritual progress. We have to, as it were, make our speech like a beautifully scented flower. And in a way, our speech is informed by how we lead our lives. So we have to have an integrated life. We have to walk the walk as well as talk the talk. We have to be wholehearted in our spiritual life. And a manifestation of that wholeheartedness would be speech like the beautiful scent of a flower. So moving on to verse 12 of the 16, we have, I shall read, sandalwood or aromatic resin, blue lotus or wild jasmine. Of all these kinds of fragrance, the odour of virtue is unsurpassed. Sandalwood or aromatic resin, blue lotus or wild jasmine. Of all these kinds of fragrance, the odour of virtue is unsurpassed. So in this section, we can read virtue as being ethics. And what we're being told is that the odour of an ethical life is unsurpassed, and the odour of an ethical life can scent the world around us. So an ethical life, as you all know, is a life that is led by the 5 precepts. So the 5 precepts that we all chant very often at the beginning of Buddhist ceremonies, and the 5 precepts that we declare our adherence to when we become mitras. So the 5 precepts are both positive and negative formulations, the positive ones being the ones that we chant. And these are that we lead our lives with deeds of loving kindness, with open-handed generosity, with stillness, simplicity, and contentment, that we follow useful, truthful speech, and in a way they're all kind of wrapped up in trying to be as mindful of our ethical behaviour at all times. And what's being said is that people who lead that life have living a perfumed life, a beautiful life, an attractive and fulfilled life. Now, I know for myself, some years ago, I had just finished a 10-day mindfulness retreat at our retreat centre in Scotland called Dhammapada, a very, very beautiful retreat centre. And after the retreat was finished, I was travelling to visit my sister, who lives about half an hour away from the retreat centre. And I was in a very good state. I'd had a 10-day retreat. I'd been very ethical, had a long periods of silence. I felt very integrated, very emotionally positive. And on that short journey of half an hour, 45 minutes, can't remember exactly, I remember I had about 4 different conversations with people. So people on platform, not people from the retreat, but people on platforms at train stations, people on the train, people at the other end, a taxi driver taking me to my sister. I had a whole series of people who seemed quite happy, almost attracted to talking to me. For no particular reason, I did not initiate the conversations. And the only thing I can think at the time, and looking back on that, is that just the way I was at my best after 10 days intensive meditation, good sleep, ethical behaviour, listening inwardly, feeling more integrated, that had somehow perfumed me. I certainly wasn't wearing any perfume, so it wasn't that. But that, by just my being, was somehow more perfumed. And that perfume was attractive. These were all quite lovely conversations, all the ones that I had, and they were quite uninvited. So even in my own experience, I have a sense of the truth of these words, that leading an ethical, integrated spiritual life is, in a way, a perfume for the world, and it is an attractive perfume to the world. So finally, just sort of sum up by saying that leading a Dharma life wholeheartedly, relishing the insight we achieve through our silence and our listening to our inner voices, by being less concerned with others than an awareness of ourselves, and having the 5 precepts as the rudder to our lives, then by that we can live a beautiful life that perfumes the world around us. So it would be good to discuss that a bit more when you get into your groups. You should have about 20 minutes for your groups. And I'll give you a couple of questions to take into the groups. So the 2 questions that you can discuss, do feel free to discuss anything. Do you find your spiritual life beautiful? Do you find your spiritual life beautiful? And the second question is, have you ever experienced the perfume of somebody else leading a spiritual life? Or have you ever experienced the perfume of somebody's practice? So, on that note, got plenty of time for your discussion groups. I haven't run over. So, yes, enjoy your groups, and we'll be back again shortly after 9 o'clock.